welcome back. In this tutorial, I'm going to go over sewing a gather stitch into a plain seam. So what is gathering? There's the definition of gathering on page 100 in your textbook. So gathering is the process of drawing up fabric fullness along the stitch line and distributing the fullness where desired. Many garments require that pieces be gathered before they are sewn into a seam, which you'll see today, and gathers may be used in a garment section or design details such as ruffles, ruching, flounces. They can be used in dirndl skirts, fuller puffed sleeves, and style lines of a dress or blouse. This is an example in your textbook of gathering being used in ruffles on a dress. This past couple seasons, I'd say, gather seams and tiered dresses have been really popular. You'll note your book recommends using a gathering foot. Anytime you sew a gather stitch. However, we don't have a gathering foot, so we're actually going to do this using two basting stitches, stitch lines, just like you learned last week. You'll notice the book doesn't necessarily recommend this, but I have gathered this way my whole life. So it's a good alternative if you do not have a gather foot. So for this tutorial, you should have, let's see, do I have them in the back? Just two of the basic, no, I do not have it, pattern pieces that you used for your plain seam and your plain seam using a basted stitch last week. So you need two of these. When you're gathering, you're going to sew the fabric piece that is gathered or bunched up. It'll be a lot smaller to a smaller piece. So typically, if you're using really thin fabric, you have a 3 or 4 to 1 ratio, a mid-weight fabric about a 2 to 1 ratio, and a heavyweight fabric would be about a 1.5 to 1 ratio. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about, you'll get it in a second. So the first thing I want you guys to do once you have your two rectangles is you're going to fold, or using your ruler, measure one in half and cut it in half so that you have two pieces. Now you can discard one of those pieces. You won't need it. I recommend reusing it and being sustainable, so keep it on the side in case you want to test out your sewing machine. Next up, we are going to use the gather stitch you guys learned last week. We learned it as a temporary stitch to keep fabric in place, but it can also be used for gathering when you do 2 rows of a basted stitch. So for this, we want to turn our stitch length back up to a 4 and stitch width we keep to a 1. The first thing we want to do is we're going to sew 2 rows of gather stitches right along the side of our pattern piece. We want to have a very small seam allowance. So just smaller than 1/4 inch. So to do that, we're going to move our needle to the right. This will allow us to sew closer to the edge of the fabric. And then on the Singer heavy duty machines we're using, if you line up your fabric even with the edge of the presser foot, that's equivalent to 1/4 inch when the needle's in the center. So like I said, since we're moving this needle over, we're going to be slightly smaller than 1/4 inch. So the idea behind a gather stitch is we're going to sew our 2 basted stitches, and then we're going to pull the thread to gather the material. So it's really, really crucial that you guys have a long train of thread both at the beginning and end of your stitch line. If you don't have a long train of thread, you won't be able to pull this and you'll have to redo it. So like I said, I'm just lining up my fabric with the edge of the presser foot. I'm going to lower the presser foot. Because this is a basted stitch, I am not going to backstitch. If you backstitch, you won't be able to pull the thread. So I'm just going to go ahead. I like to keep my hand on my fabric and also on my thread when I start sewing again, so it doesn't get sucked up into the machine or jammed. And I'm just going to begin sewing right alongside the edge of the fabric. Okay, so now you can see my needle's up. I'm going to raise my presser foot and I'm going to pull out my thread and I'm going to snip it, leaving about 5 inches there. Like I said, you need that train of thread. So I have my first row of basted stitches with a train of thread on each side. Now I'm going to add my second row. For that, I'm going to do the exact same thing I just did, but this time I'm going to line up the edge of my presser foot with the edge of the existing stitches. So instead of lining it up with the side of the fabric, I'm going to line it up with my stitch line so that it'll be slightly farther to the left. Again, I have strings, a train of string. I'm going to leave that there. I'm not going to cut it off because I need it later. My presser foot's down and I'm just going to sew right along that existing stitch line. Oops, I sewed a little farther off the edge than I wanted to, but that's okay. Again, pulling that thread and leaving a nice train of thread. So what my pattern piece looks like now, I have 2 rows of basted stitching and I have 4 loose threads on each side.